December 7, 1941, 7:48 a.m. Above the island of Oahu, Rear Admiral Nagumo's strike forces were executing a plan predicated on one massive, tragic miscalculation: the belief that the American will to fight was as fragile as its Pacific fleet. For the commanders of Imperial Japan, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not the goal itself, but the necessary precondition for a grand, swift resource grab across Southeast Asia. The architects of this sudden war, primarily the Army General Staff and the Naval General Staff, knew they held a momentary advantage, a fleeting window of opportunity measured in months, not years. Their entire strategy, the Nanshin-Ran or Southern Expansion Doctrine, was a frantic, high-stakes gamble against the world's most potent industrial engine. Japan, an island nation devoid of critical resources, was already being choked by an American oil embargo, a political maneuver that functioned as a slow-motion declaration of war. By late 1941, their strategic oil reserves were dwindling rapidly. Estimates suggested the fleet could not operate effectively for more than 2 years without access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies. To survive, Japan had to expand. To expand without interference, the American Pacific Fleet had to be neutralized. This created the illusion of a short war fought not to conquer the United States, but merely to occupy the resource-rich perimeter and establish an impregnable defensive ring, the so-called Absolute National Defense Zone. Once the zone was established, they believed America would be faced with the prospect of an immensely long, bloody, and expensive war across thousands of miles of ocean, a political calculation they were convinced Washington would refuse to make. They would sue for a negotiated peace, allowing Japan to keep the spoils, the oil, the rubber, the tin required for self-sufficiency. This entire edifice of strategy rested on a profound misunderstanding of the American psyche and, more critically, the depth of its industrial capacity. Japanese military culture prized spiritual strength, rigorous training, and the decisive, overwhelming initial blow known as Kantai Kessen. They had calculated the recovery time for the U.S. Navy based on existing peacetime shipbuilding rates, failing utterly to account for the speed and scale of American mobilization once truly provoked. They saw isolationism and debate. They missed the deep-seated national anger that one catastrophic, unprovoked attack would unleash. Even among the Japanese planners, there were voices of chilling foresight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who designed the Pearl Harbor attack itself, famously studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington, giving him a terrifying perspective on American potential. He is widely credited with the warning that the initial success would merely wake a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Yamamoto knew that while Japan could run wild for 6 months or perhaps a year the moment the Detroit assembly line shifted from automobiles to tanks, and the vast shipyards of the West Coast began producing Essex-class carriers like loaves of bread, the strategic clock would strike midnight for the empire. The resulting campaigns of early 1942, the conquest of Singapore, the capture of the Philippines, the fall of the Dutch East Indies, were stunning in their swiftness and efficiency. Japan achieved their resource goals far faster than anticipated. They gained the oil, the land, and the strategic depth they craved. But every victory consumed men, fuel, and, most crucially, the precious aircraft carriers and skilled pilots needed for the inevitable counterpunch. The illusion of swift victory proved to be a fatal diversion, requiring Japan to expedite material and personnel, securing a perimeter that was ultimately too vast to defy. The energy spent achieving the initial knockout blow was energy lost for the war of attrition that quickly followed. The Japanese high command, in their obsession with a short, politically expedient war, essentially defined the very terms of their eventual destruction. They traded the resource chokehold they faced in 1941 for an insurmountable material and industrial chokehold administered by the United States starting in 1943. The legacy of that initial stunning offensive is the hard lesson that military prowess is often irrelevant when facing an industrial behemoth whose motivation you have fundamentally failed to grasp. Their early victories bought them resources, but they simultaneously bought the American public's unity and an unwavering commitment to total war, a commitment that ultimately ensured their complete and irreversible defeat. This was the terrifying price of waking the giant. December 7, 1941, 7:55 a.m. Over Pearl Harbor, the first wave of Japanese aircraft dropped out of the Hawaiian morning sky, shattering the tranquility of a peacetime Sunday with a sudden, overwhelming torrent of fire and steel. This was the moment of tactical perfection that Japanese military leaders had long envisioned. For the pilots and the commanders who planned the strike, the execution was flawless, a masterful demonstration of coordinated air power designed to cripple the American Pacific Fleet at its moorings. Battleships erupted into flaming wreckage, hangars dissolved into smoke, and within 2 hours, the core strength of American naval presence in the Pacific lay burning or sunk in the shallow waters of Oahu. The initial reports reaching Tokyo were met with euphoria. The great wager had paid off. The American fleet, the primary obstacle to Japan's expansion into the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia, was neutralized. The military establishment believed this crippling blow would buy them the 6 months necessary to secure their conquests, fortify their perimeter, and compel the Americans into a negotiated peace, recognizing the new reality of Asian power. They had won the opening battle. They believed the subsequent, short war would follow their script. Yet thousands of miles away, the man who designed the devastating attack harbored an ominous dread that overshadowed any feeling of triumph. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, understood America far better than the jingoistic ideologues in the Imperial Army. Yamamoto had studied and served in the United States. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit, the immense scale of American agriculture, and, crucially, the deep, inherent resolve of a nation slow to anger but terrible in its wrath. It is widely recounted that when told of the operational success at Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto did not celebrate. Instead, a profound weariness settled over him. His reported fear, bordering on prophecy, was clear. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Yamamoto knew the true measure of success was not how many ships were sunk on a Sunday morning, but how many ships the Americans could launch 18 months later. He understood that America's ability to wage war rested not on its standing peacetime navy, but on its untapped industrial muscle, the very capacity the Japanese leadership had willfully discounted. Pearl Harbor, while a military coup, was perhaps the greatest strategic blunder in modern warfare because it failed to grasp the psychological cost of the bargain. The attack unified the American public instantly. Before December 7th, isolationism had deep roots, and the idea of entering another world war was highly unpopular. After December 7th, there was no division. Isolationism was vaporized by the shockwaves of the bombs falling on American territory. Congress nearly unanimously declared war, backed by a population suddenly committed to total victory, fueled by rage and focused on vengeance. The technical victory of the strike bought Japan temporary resources and space, but it simultaneously sold the United States the emotional and political clarity needed for limitless mobilization. The successful swift offensive of 1941 yielded to the grinding, relentless industrial counteroffensive of 1942 and 1943. Every ship sunk was replaced by 3 more. Every plane destroyed was exchanged for dozens of Liberators and Mustangs rolling off assembly lines at a pace the Empire of Japan could never hope to match. The legacy of that single shocking Sunday is not merely the ruin of the battleships, but the profound illustration of strategic myopia. The Japanese commanders focused too narrowly on operational success, forgetting that military campaigns against global industrial powers are decided not by tactical brilliance, but by the relentless weight of material superiority. They mistook America's initial lack of preparation for a lack of will. They gambled that a sudden show of force would compel surrender or concession. Instead, they earned the complete and unwavering commitment of the world's most powerful economy, dedicated entirely to their annihilation. The price of waking the giant was the eventual destruction of the Japanese Empire. The attack on Pearl Harbor, meant to ensure a short, victorious war, guaranteed the longest, most brutal conflict in the Pacific theater, setting into motion an irreversible tide that swept Japan toward defeat. It stands forever as the tragic reminder that the cost of underestimating an adversary's reserve of fury and power is often the total loss of everything. December 8, 1941, 12:30 p.m. In the chamber of the House of Representatives, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress, defining the previous day as a date which will live in infamy. The collective response of the American populace and its elected officials instantly crystallized the fractured political landscape. Isolationism, the dominant sentiment that had defined American foreign policy for a decade, dissolved overnight. The long, contentious debate about whether to enter the conflict at the moment the bombs fell on Oahu. The question was no longer if America should fight, but how fast and how completely it could obliterate the source of the attack. Congress voted for war with near unanimity, and the mandate given to the nation was simple: total mobilization. This was not merely a military declaration. It was the forging of a singular national purpose, rarely seen in history. Regional differences, labor disputes, and political feuds were largely subsumed beneath the immediate, visceral mandate of retribution and total victory. The shock of the attack rapidly transitioned into a fierce, unwavering, and unified resolve. The American economy, already recovering from the Great Depression, was placed onto a war footing unparalleled in human history. The government issued the largest industrial mandate ever conceived, demanding the conversion of every available resource toward the war effort. The assembly lines that had built millions of civilian automobiles were immediately repurposed for tanks, aircraft, and armored vehicles. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, originally intended for civilian production, became the epicenter of this shift, transforming into the largest bomber factory on Earth, designed to churn out B-24 Liberators at a pace that stunned even Allied planners. The mandate was simple: produce faster, produce more, and produce better than the combined industrial output of the Axis powers. Shipyards that specialized in passenger liners began rolling out standardized merchant vessels, the famed Liberty ships, in weeks instead of months. Maritime engineer Henry Kaiser introduced revolutionary assembly techniques using prefabricated sections, dramatically cutting construction time until, by 1942, a massive freighter could be built in just over 4 days. Japan's initial strategy relied on America lacking the will and the capacity to fight a two-ocean war. The reality was that the mobilized United States soon developed the capacity to fight two global conflicts while simultaneously acting as the arsenal of democracy for its allies. This industrial fury demanded a complete societal commitment. Millions of young men rushed to recruiting stations, swelling the ranks of the Army and Navy, but the mobilization went far deeper than enlistment. Suddenly, every citizen was a combatant on the home front. Scrap metal drives salvaged millions of tons of steel, rubber, and aluminum necessary for tank and aircraft production. Ration books governed consumption of gasoline, meat, sugar, and shoes, ensuring that finite resources flowed first to the fighting forces. The cultural icon of Rosie the Riveter embodied the millions of women who flooded into factories, aircraft plants, and shipyards, performing jobs previously deemed impossible for women. This was not merely employment. It was a deeply patriotic contribution that radically and permanently reshaped American social expectations. By 1944, the mobilized United States was producing 90,000 aircraft a year. Over 1,200 major warships and 5,000 merchant vessels were launched during the conflict. The American industrial output alone ultimately exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The sheer, terrifying weight of this production defined the Pacific War's trajectory. Japan could replace nothing lost in battle. America treated losses as temporary setbacks to be overcome by immediate, overwhelming replacement. The surprise attack had not paralyzed the giant. It had instead provided the necessary electrical shock to unleash its full, unrelenting, and terrifying power. The true victory of Pearl Harbor for the American side was not tactical but spiritual, the achievement of total national unity. The mobilization mandate became the lasting legacy of that day, proving that in the face of existential threat, a complex democracy could streamline its vast resources and national will into a single, unstoppable force. Japan had calculated the assets of the U.S. Navy. They failed entirely to calculate the limitless resource of the American people's unified outrage. The price of that miscalculation was the total loss of everything. February 19, 1942. The sprawling shipyards of Richmond, California. The mandate given by President Roosevelt just weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely ambitious, it was perceived globally as entirely delusional. 60,000 planes, 45,000 tanks, and 8 million tons of shipping, all to be built within that calendar year. These were production figures that dwarfed the combined capacity of the entire Axis powers. Figures meant to shock the American public into action, and perhaps more importantly, to psychologically stun the enemy. Yet this was the exact moment when the sleeping giant truly woke. Not with a military roar, but with the deafening clang of steel being hammered into reality across the breadth of the continent. America was not just mobilizing the Army and Navy, it was mobilizing the entire national economy, turning Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Los Angeles into the functional arsenal of democracy. The transformation was swift, driven by necessity and unprecedented financial investment. Existing corporate structures were adapted, streamlined, or entirely bypassed by new industrial titans like Henry Kaiser, who brought standardized assembly line efficiency to the highly specialized craft of shipbuilding. Prior to the war, constructing a major freighter took months, relying heavily on traditional, bespoke craftsmanship. Kaiser's method was simple and brutal: standardization and prefabrication. A single, unified design, the ubiquitous Liberty ship was engineered for maximum simplicity, comprised of hundreds of interchangeable components built in decentralized factories across the nation and then welded together at the docks. This wasn't shipbuilding in the traditional sense. It was war material assembly applied to the largest scale. In 1941, before the U.S. formally entered the war, the nation built 100 merchant ships. By 1942, leveraging this new methodology, that number surged to 746. This initial rate was quickly deemed insufficient, then immediately surpassed. The record for constructing a standard Liberty ship fell from 56 days to 10 days. Then, pushing the limits of human logistics, the SS Robert E. Peary was completed from the moment of keel laying to launch in just 4 days and 15 hours, an industrial miracle that proved that time itself, not just territory or resources, was the new commodity America was manufacturing. Simultaneously, in the industrial heartland, the automotive giants abandoned passenger vehicles overnight. General Motors stopped producing Oldsmobiles and Buicks and started churning out Sherman tanks and Corsair engines. Ford's massive Willow Run factory complex, the largest single factory building in the world at the time, was dedicated solely to the manufacture of B-24 Liberator bombers. Ford perfected the modular design of the bomber, creating a system so efficient that by the height of production, one B-24 was rolling off the line every 63 minutes. This monumental deluge of material required a workforce that did not yet exist. Millions of previously untapped laborers, women, famously symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, and minority groups flooded the factories. Their patriotism was coupled with economic opportunity. Their immense collective labor became the logistical lifeblood that would relentlessly drown the Axis war machine. The sheer volume of material flowing across the Atlantic and Pacific, dubbed the Bridge of Ships, not only defied logistics, but overwhelmed strategic military calculation. Japan's initial strategic models, based on a limited war of attrition and a precise calculation of existing American naval assets, were reread hopelessly obsolete the moment the first wave of Liberty ships hit the water. They had meticulously calculated the oil reserves, the number of existing battleships, and the trained naval personnel. They failed entirely to account for the nation's latent industrial potential, the ability to mobilize millions of inexperienced workers, and the corporate ingenuity that saw the war not just as a fight for survival, but as an opportunity for unprecedented technical standardization and organizational achievement. The Axis powers were fighting a focused, professional military against a nation that had effectively turned its entire immense economy into a singular, dedicated weapon of total destruction. The factories, the shipyards, and the assembly lines became the true, decisive front lines of the war, forging the hardware that ensured Allied victory. Every tank, every shell, and every aircraft produced in that phenomenal year of 1942 was a direct, undeniable answer to the bombs that fell on Pearl Harbor. The forge of democracy was heated by outrage and fueled by industry. It permanently shifted the global balance of power, not through immediate battlefield conquest, but through the overwhelming capacity to manufacture the means of victory. This unparalleled mobilization proved that the foundational strength of the American system was not its geography or its wealth alone, but its spectacular adaptability, its ability to take complex, decentralized interests and align them instantly toward a singular, existential goal. The lasting legacy of 1942 is that true power does not lie merely in the size of the initial punch, but in the overwhelming, relentless, and accelerating weight of the counterpunch. The giant was awake, and it was manufacturing doom on an industrial scale, sealing the fate of the war long before the final shots were ever fired. July 10th, 1943. Within the somber war rooms beneath the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the grim reality of the United States awakening settled over the Japanese Army and Navy general staffs. The initial shock of Midway and Guadalcanal had faded, replaced now by the cold, statistical dread delivered via intelligence reports. These documents, detailing U.S. shipyard output and aircraft factory throughput, were not strategic estimates. They were cruel arithmetic, laying bare the impossibility of the situation. The Americans were replacing entire fleets before the damaged Japanese ships could limp home for repairs, and they were doing it months ahead of schedule. The war of decisive battles, the only kind of war Japan could ever hope to win, was over. The window for a negotiated peace, based on early successes forcing a diplomatic pause, was sealed shut, not with diplomatic failure, but with concrete, steel, and inexhaustible oil. The question ceased to be, how do we win the war? And immediately morphed into the desperate calculation, how do we make them stop fighting us? This shift necessitated the adoption of the deadly strategy of attrition, or Zokureikosen protracted defense. If Japan could not defeat the American industrial machine, they would instead attempt to defeat American willpower. The new strategy aimed to bleed the United States dry, trading irreplaceable Japanese men and materiel in strategically hopeless island garrisons for incremental yet terrifyingly high American casualty counts. The hope was that massive U.S. losses, the sight of thousands of young Americans coming home in coffins, would turn the American electorate against the war and pressure Washington into accepting a negotiated peace, allowing Japan to retain some measure of imperial integrity. This strategy, however, failed to grasp the fundamental logic of the ledger against an opponent of infinite capacity. When a nation is producing 4 aircraft carriers for every one sunk and 15 advanced fighters for every 0 downed, the arithmetic of exchange breaks down entirely. Japan was willingly entering a zero-sum game against a foe whose production rate was expanding exponentially. Consider the sheer velocity of American production just by 1943. The U.S. was producing nearly 86,000 aircraft annually, a number that dwarfed the entire operational inventory Japan possessed. For every ton of shipping Japan could move through its diminishing oceanic supply lines, the United States was launching 20. The Japanese were exchanging irreplaceable veteran pilots and finite resources for American materiel crewed by men and machinery they could replace almost instantly. The High Command was choosing to pay 2 lives and 2 ships to inflict the loss of 1 life and 1 ship on an enemy who was simultaneously building 10 new ships and training 20 new replacements. The tragedy of this period lies in the professional assessment of the data. Many senior Japanese planners, particularly within the Navy, understood the fatal geometry of the situation. They knew that the resources needed to simply sustain the status quo exceeded the national output. Yet, the pervasive military culture, steeped in the principles of Bushido and the unshakable belief that national spirit and sacrifice would ultimately overcome the vulgar materialism of the West, demanded continued resistance. Admitting defeat was not merely dishonorable. It was deemed impossible for the survival of the Kokutai, the national essence. Even if continued fighting guaranteed total destruction, they chose to pay the ultimate price to prove a flawed philosophical point against an implacable industrial machine. The subsequent campaigns, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the final decision to resist until the bitter, were not attempts to achieve military victory, but acts of strategic sacrifice designed only to maximize the American body count. The closed window of 1943 marked the moment the Japanese High Command functionally turned the nation into a sacrificial offering. The legacy is the horrifying cost paid for prioritizing cultural narrative and perceived honor over objective reality and logistics. It stands as the clearest proof of the totalizing nature of industrial conflict, that courage, dedication, and profound sacrifice, however deeply held, cannot defeat the overwhelming, relentless, and accelerating weight of manufactured power. They woke the giant, and when it showed them the scale of its anger written in staggering tonnage figures, they chose to fight the numbers themselves, ensuring that the war would not in negotiation, but in complete, devastating annihilation. August 15th, 1945. In the scorched ruins of Tokyo, the silence was not peace, but the echoing sound of consequences finally settling. The devastating results of the Pacific War stand today as a permanent, chilling testament to the price of prioritizing cultural narrative and perceived honor over objective reality and logistical capacity. The legacy of the conflict is defined by that initial catastrophic miscalculation, the belief that the United States, perceived as soft, luxurious, and racially divided, lacked the moral fortitude, the national unity, or the industrial patience necessary to fight a total, protracted war of annihilation. They had underestimated America's capacity for righteous fury, but more fatefully, they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the modern industrial state. They saw material wealth as a sign of decadence. Washington saw it as reserve capacity. They focused on defeating fleets and armies. America focused on erasing the possibility of Japan ever fielding another fleet or army. The true sleeping giant was never just the U.S. Navy stationed at Pearl Harbor. It was the entire continental economy, instantly retooling itself into a specialized, unrelenting instrument of global conflict. It was the mobilization of capital, labor, and technology on a scale that dwarfed the combined production of the Axis powers. By 1944, America was producing 1 aircraft carrier every 2 months, while Japan struggled for fuel and material simply to repair existing ships. The numerical disparities ceased to be mere statistical comparisons. They became existential threats. The overwhelming weight of American material was not an adjunct to strategy. It became the strategy itself. The philosophical clash at the heart of the Pacific War remains its most profound lesson. On one side stood the rigid, spiritualized doctrine of Ketsugo, where the will of the soldier superseded technological limits. The idea that spirit could overcome steel. On the other side stood the merciless doctrine of mass production, where the outcome was determined not by the tenacity of individual soldiers, but by the tonnage of steel, the flow of oil, and the rate of fire delivered by factory workers thousands of miles away. The war revealed the terrifying truth of 20th century warfare, that the sheer scale of the industrial output creates an unavoidable asymmetry. Courage, dedication, and profound sacrifice, however deeply held or spiritually motivated, cannot defeat the relentless, accelerating weight of manufactured power. Japan did not lose the war in the Solomons or on Guadalcanal. They lost it in the American shipyards of 1942, in the aluminum plants of 1943, and in the sheer, unimaginable throughput of the war economy they had so foolishly antagonized. The war's legacy is the definitive proof of the totalizing nature of industrial conflict. For every soldier lost on the island beaches, 10 workers labored in the distant foundries to build the replacement tank, the extra bomber, and the unending supply chain of logistics that smothered Japanese resistance piece by piece. The destruction visited upon the Japanese homeland, culminating in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was the final devastating payment for the initial misreading of their opponent's fundamental character, the failure to grasp the velocity and scale of modern American industrial rage. We look back at the millions of lives expired across the Pacific theater, and we see not only the failure of diplomacy, but the totalizing failure of strategic realism. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, hoping to prevent a protracted war they knew they could not win, only to guarantee the exact total war that led to their complete devastating annihilation. That is the lasting echo of 1941, a crushing reminder that in the age of the machine, the ultimate defining power is not the bravery of the warrior, but the inexhaustible capacity of the industrial furnace, once fully dedicated to vengeance. The consequences of waking the giant Ur, not only in history books, but as a chilling, permanent warning against the hubris of misjudging power.